It's time to introduce you to our second speaker, Dr. Sajjad Raza, who is a biogeochemist and loves exploring the wonders of soil. He is a proud alumnus of the subcampus Depalpur, Okara, and UF, who is currently a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Chicago, Illinois, United States. Prior to that, he did 2 postdocs and PhD in China. He did 1 postdoc at Nanjing University of Information Science and Technology, and second at the Northwest Agriculture and Forestry University, Yangling, and did his PhD from the College of Natural Resources and Environment, Northwest A&F University, Yangling, China. Dr. Sajjad's research interests are biogeochemistry of carbon and nitrogen in the global agroecosystems, global and regional estimates of carbon losses from nitrogen-induced soil acidification, greenhouse gas emissions, global nitrogen budget, nitrogen use efficiency, dynamics of residual nitrogen accumulation, etc. So may I now invite Dr. Sajjad Raz for delivering his online talk on the consequences of inefficient nitrogen utilization on soil acidification, eutrophication, and biodiversity loss. So the floor is yours, Dr. Sajjad. Over to you.
Hello, Doctor. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I have shared my screen, so let's give it some time to load it. Well, thank you very much for giving me this interview, this opportunity for the webinar. I appreciate organizing this webinar on World Biodiversity Day. As I was introduced, I am Sajjad Raz. I'm currently doing postdoc at University of Chicago, and today I'll be talking about consequences of inefficient nitrogen utilization on acidification, eutrophication, and biodiversity loss. So in this slide, before going further, I will just give a brief background of nitrogen. We call it as nitrogen is a good thing. Why? Because it is an essential macronutrient, and it's used to have improved crop yield worldwide. And it is estimated that about half of the global population alive today is partially due to the use of nitrogen fertilizer. Now let's take a look at the global preview of the nitrogen use since 1960s till to 2015. So we can see that the nitrogen input, this input includes the nitrogen from the fertilizers, atmospheric nitrogen deposition, manure, and the manure, all the nitrogen inputs that are added in the soil. So they were around 43 teragram per year during 1960s, and it has massively increased up to 172 teragram during 2015. So we have massively increased nitrogen input. But the problem is that our nitrogen use efficiency, which is the percentage share of the nitrogen that is consumed by the crops. The nitrogen use efficiency, it was around 60, exactly 56% in 1960s, and it has continuously decreased, and currently it is up to 46%. So you can see that the gap between the nitrogen input and the nitrogen use efficiency is widening. So this is an issue, and if we look at the 4 countries as a case study, the China, India, and Pakistan, their nitrogen use efficiency was around, for China it was around 70%, India and Pakistan it was around 50%. And if we see it now, it is around 30 or less than 30%. For Pakistan it is exactly 26% now. And if we see USA, the nitrogen use efficiency has not decreased, or it remained the same. So if I take you further on this China, India, and Pakistan scenario, these 3 countries, they share around half of the global population. They consume 42% of the global nitrogen input. But the nitrogen, surplus nitrogen, is 53% contributed by these 3 countries compared to the world. So now, considering this, China, India, and Pakistan is a challenge. The nitrogen scenario in these countries is a challenge, and it is also an opportunity. Why opportunity? Because if we control these countries, improve nitrogen management in these countries, we can improve decrease nitrogen pollution or other associated losses. And in this figure, I will show the surplus nitrogen contribution by different countries. And if you see the upper left figure with blue, the blue outline, you can see that these 6 countries, China, India, US, Brazil, Pakistan, and Soviet Union, they contributed about 70% of the global nitrogen surplus. And these, out of these 70% global nitrogen surplus, China and India are the major contributors. And the contribution of Pakistan is 3.3%. And the another 9 countries, major 9 countries, the nitrogen surplus in these countries is above 1,000 gigagram nitrogen per year. So all the countries, all the 15 countries on the left panel, they contribute around 80% of the global surplus nitrogen. So the nitrogen surplus is concentrated in few countries, and it's not the same all over the world. And if you see the figure at the bottom side, these 15 countries contribute 9% of the surplus nitrogen, and on the right side, their surplus nitrogen contribution is less than 300. They contribute 5%. And interestingly, there are still bunch of countries where surplus nitrogen is less, and they contribute only 2% share in the world. And if you can see on the right, bottom right, and at the right side, there are few countries where the surplus nitrogen is negative. And why it is negative? Because these countries are mining nitrogen. They are not adding more nitrogen. The crops are taking more compared to the amount that they are adding into the soil. So overall, this picture shows that either the world has, almost all countries, they have more surplus nitrogen, and this is an issue for the world. Why it is an issue? Because it is accelerating climate crisis. And why it is accelerating climate crisis? Because nitrogen, directly or indirectly, directly by N2O emission and indirectly by ammonia, CO2 and methane, it causes greenhouse gas emissions. By ammonia, we have the PM 2.5 concentration in the air increasing. We are experiencing air pollution scenarios all over the world. There is smoke in the winter, and the water pollution is on rise because of the nutrient enrichment, mainly nitrate pollution. And because of this, there is eutrophication and biodiversity loss and soil acidification. And for this talk, I'll be focusing on 2 things: soil acidification and eutrophication. And this figure, it shows all the acidification processes that are almost, I can say that are approximately known. Okay, I'll give some time for the slide to load. So in this slide, that I'm trying to show that what are the global and major drivers of acidification. And broadly speaking, they can be divided into 2 categories: natural acidification processes and anthropogenic acidification processes. And nitrogen and natural could be because of lightning, rainfall, CO2, the carbon dioxide release from the roots, and organic matter mineralization, organic acid release from the root exudates. And all these natural factors, their acidification potential is less. They cannot acidify soils quickly if we consider the anthropogenic acidification sources. And by anthropogenic, I mean the nitrogen fertilizer, all the human activities, the increase in the legume production and the nitrogen input because of biological nitrogen fixation. There is rise in atmospheric nitrogen deposition and addition of nitrogen fertilizer. And for nitrogen fertilizer, this is one of the major causes of acidification in the world. How this acidification happens from nitrogen fertilizer is because 66% of the global nitrogen that we are adding to the soil is in the form of ammonium. And here you can see the example of different nitrogen fertilizer sources: urea, ammonium nitrate, calcium ammonium nitrate, ammonium bicarbonate, and others. So all these nitrogen fertilizer sources, they have different potential to release protons. If you see the ammonium phosphate, 1 mole of ammonium phosphate can release 6 protons, and ammonium sulfate can release 4 protons, and urea, the well-known fertilizer, it releases 2 protons. And all these protons that are being added to the soil from ammonium is because of the nitrification process. Nitrification is the microbial oxidation of ammonium into the nitrate. And during this process, there is a release of 2 protons. And why this nitrification is important? Because its acidification rate is almost 10 to 100 times more than acid deposition. So you can see that this can cause acidification of soils within decades. In our field experiment, we conducted a field experiment for 2, and in this experiment, we added nitrogen fertilizer in the form of urea, and we also added nitrification inhibitor (DCD) with urea. And the DCD treatments, they are highlighted with blue color, and the black dotted colors, they are highlighted with they are the urea treatments. And you can see that after the addition of fertilizer, and we took samples at different intervals of time, and you can see that these black lines, they are at the bottom because the pH decreased in these treatments where no DCD was added. It was quick because they were just urea. And when we added DCD, these blue lines, their pH decrease was not as rapid. And we observed the same in wheat, and even in maize, the pH decrease was quite rapid compared to wheat. And this is because the nitrification inhibitor, it inhibited the nitrification process, and as a result, there was more availability of ammonium in the soil, which is why there was less acidification. And you know, in field experiment, different things happens. You cannot control those things, and just to verify whether this decrease in pH is happening because of the addition of fertilizer, we conducted an incubation experiment under lab settings, and this also proved that the addition of urea decreased pH quickly. And this decrease in pH, it was rapid in urea, and it was significantly less when we added DCD. And you can see that at 2 temperature levels and at 2 moisture levels, we observe the same phenomenon. Well, let's go further into this acidification theme. So this figure is a global map. It's showing that nitrogen fertilization induced acidification is happening worldwide. And these blue shaded areas, these are the soils all over the world where acidification is already happening. These soils are already acidic, and the area of all those soils is up to 4 billion hectares. So world already has 4 billion hectares of acidic soils. And additionally, because of continuous increase in nitrogen fertilization, there is a risk of addition of another 2 billion hectares of acidic soils in the world because of, and this all acidification was calculated because of the nitrogen fertilization. And this acidification is very important because pH is considered as a master variable. If there is a change in pH, it means it's going to impact all other physical, chemical, and biological properties. And in this figure on the left, it's a global meta-analysis. And in this, you can see that the pH has decreased. Right on top left, the pH has decreased. And with this decrease in pH, there is decrease in the availability of base cations, potassium, sodium, magnesium, and calcium. And these are nutrients. And their availability decreases means it's going to impact the crop's growth and yield. And similarly, with acidification, there is more availability of aluminum and iron. And this happens when the soil becomes even more acidic, highly acidic, when the pH is less than 5. And this is going to cause toxicity, and under extreme cases, the plant growth cannot happen. And in terms of biological activities, you can see that soil respiration, fine root biomass, molecular biomass, carbon, nitrogen, and bacterial diversity, they all have decreased, and the abundance of fungi has increased. So there is a disruption in the balance of the bacterial fungi to bacteria ratio, microbial activity, and its composition. They are all impacted by the acidification process. Now, we discuss about how it's going to impact the yield, because at the end, we are more concerned about the yield. And in this figure, you can clearly see that when the pH is high, there was more maize yield. And as the pH decreased, the maize yield strongly decreased. And you can see there are three dots right above 4.5. It means when the pH decrease was more, the pH was around 4.5, the maize yield decreased very sharply. And we observed the same in legume crop, barley and fafa bean, and they were also, their yield was high when the pH was around neutral, and they strongly decreased when the pH started decreasing below 5.5. Let's take a look at the cereal crops, because these are the major staple crops, the wheat, maize, and the rice. And you can see that when the pH was around 6 or around 6 or 6.5, the yield was consistent. There was not much decrease or increase. But when the pH was less than 5, you can see that there was an exponential decrease in the yield of all those cereals. So this means that if we continue to add nitrogen fertilizer, it's inefficient use, and when the pH goes below 5, it's going to impact our food security. Now I will just introduce you towards another largely unknown impact of acidification, nitrogen-induced acidification on inorganic carbon losses. Globally, most of the research focus is on organic carbon, and the inorganic carbon, which is also impacted. It's generally considered that inorganic carbon is very stable. It does not change within human time scale, but this acidification, it's decreasing in organic carbon stocks. And in this paper, we have quantified this inorganic carbon losses due to acidification by calculating the acidification from all nitrogen fertilizer sources in China. If you see this 1980 map, the inorganic carbon contents were 16.3 megagram carbon per hectare in 1980s. And after 40 years of nitrogen fertilization, 7 million hectares of Chinese cropland area has lost its inorganic carbon stocks, and it's 7% of inorganic carbon stocks of the whole China. And if this scenario of the business as usual follows, the continuous increasing, there is continuous increase in nitrogen fertilizer up to 2,100 a year. It's expected that 37% of inorganic carbon stocks of the China will be completely lost, and it will be making 30 million hectares of Chinese cropland without carbonates. And this now, because this was focused on China, and in the next table I'm going to show that these inorganic carbon losses and acidification because of nitrogen fertilizer is happening all over the world. And this table shows the global long-term field experiments. You can see that these experiments, the duration of these experiments is 40, 20, 10, or up to 100 years. And nitrogen input ranges from 96 up to even 400 or 165. In all those scenarios, you can see that there is substantial decrease in pH. For example, in the first row, the nitrogen fertilizer was applied at 96 kilogram per hectare per year, and it was applied for 101 years, and there was decrease in pH by 2.5 points. And this has caused 5% of inorganic carbon losses. And there are some soils where inorganic carbon losses were even above 60% or 70%. So it means these carbonate losses due to nitrogen-induced acidification is happening all over the world. Another thing, because of this inefficient use of nitrogen fertilizer, now I'm going to take you towards eutrophication point. And this inefficient use of nitrogen fertilizer is causing the accumulation of nitrogen in the soil profile. And in this, we conducted a field experiment for 7 years. In the first year, after 2 wheat and maize rotation, when we added nitrogen fertilizer, you can see that there is substantial accumulation of the nitrate nitrogen in up to 20 to 60 centimeter of the soil profile. We keep on adding the fertilizer for the next year, and after another 2 crop rotations of wheat and maize, there was a massive accumulation. In this experiment for 2 years, we found that the increase in nitrogen accumulation, it was more in treatments where we added urea, and it was significantly less when we added urea with DCD. This addition decrease nitrogen accumulation and its leaching into the soil profile. So after 2 years, it was an issue for us that our wheat maize rotation was not efficient in utilizing nitrogen, and there is substantial accumulation of nitrate in the soil profile. So to utilize this nitrate accumulation in the soil profile, we conducted experiment, but we experiment without nitrogen fertilization for the 3rd year. And you can see that from 20 to 60 centimeter, the nitrate in this region was completely lost. It was consumed. It was mainly consumed by the wheat maize crops. It added nitrogen to the water resource. The increase in anthropogenic nitrogen inputs, with increase in that, there is increase in riverine nitrogen export, and this is happening across the North Atlantic Ocean to the coastal ocean regions of most parts of the Europe, Canada, and USA, and more or less the situation is same for rivers in China, India, and Pakistan. And this increased loading of nitrogen and also phosphorus is leading us to a phenomenon called eutrophication. It's an excessive algal growth due to increased availability of nutrients. And this algal growth, it turns the water to green color, it smells bad, it blocks sunlight, and it can even release toxins. And when this algal growth, it dies, it's decomposed by bacteria, and during this process, bacteria consumes oxygen. And with the use of this oxygen, there is depletion there is less dissolved oxygen in the water, which if keep on going can cause hypoxic environment, which we call as a dead zone. And US Environmental Protection Agency, it has indicated that 41% and 46% of streams or rivers that they had surveyed during 2008 to 9, they are impaired because of excessive nitrogen and phosphorus inputs. And similarly, the situation in China, that phosphorus loading, it has increased by 300% if we compare it to 1980. And the animal production phosphorus losses have also increased by 42 times. And this figure shows the nitrogen loading in Chinese and US aquatic systems. The nitrogen losses in China in 2009, it was 1.6 million tons of the nitrogen losses. And these nitrogen losses were mainly concentrated in Shandong, Henan, Hebei, Anhui, Jiangsu, and these provinces. And these provinces collectively contributed 60% of the Chinese nitrogen losses. And these nitrogen losses, if you see the bottom figure, these nitrogen losses are causing eutrophication. And this eutrophication is 53 gigagram, 53 giga PDF meter cube. These nitrogen losses, they are high in Midwestern agricultural belt, and they are less in forest. And 50% of the lakes that were surveyed during this region, it was 50% or more, they were eutrophic. So major economies that are adding particularly more fertilizer, there is a substantial problem of eutrophication because of high nitrogen loading in the water resources. And this nitrogen, and this figure shows that not only the nitrogen, if the addition of nitrogen alone, it can cause increase in algal growth by 180%. If there is only phosphorus increases in the water resources, this can cause 88% of the boom in algal growth. But when they are combined, when there is addition of nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer, their combination can accelerate strongly the growth of algal growth, and it can increase up to 750%. And because of this increase in nitrogen and phosphorus loading, the eutrophication is happening in most of the water, aquatic resources of the water, and increase events of massive fish killing. If you see the figure on the left, there the figure right above is the first incidents that happened in India, where 0.25 metric ton of the fish were dead, and they were not dead, they were dead and floating on the surface of the water. And the incidents happens again after 4 days, and there was up to one metric ton of the fishes that were dead fishes that were floating on the surface of the water. And why this happened? It was because when the water was analyzed, there was high organic matter and bacterial loads, there was high ammonia and phosphate, and there was hypoxemia causing low dissolved oxygen. And algal bloom were the main cause of these sudden fish kills. We take another examples of the Philippines, and major fish kill event also happened in Philippines in the fish farm in 2002, and the major condition of these fish killing was eutrophication, because there was more ammonia increased by 56% in the water resources, nitrate by 35%, nitrite by 35%, nitrate by 90%, and phosphate by 67%. And this eutrophication is not going to slow down in the future, because it has been reported that eutrophication will increase during the 21st century. Why? Because of the changes in climate and the precipitation patterns. And the precipitation is expected to increase in this century, and this increase in precipitation will eventually cause the high nitrogen loading from the cropland system into the river systems. And the areas that are susceptible for high eutrophication in the future are East, South, and Southeast Asia, like China and India, some part of the Russia, and also some parts of the US and Canada, and some parts of the Europe. So this eutrophication, I discussed about eutrophication and acidification, and these two are impacting biodiversity. And biodiversity, you know, is the variability among living organisms. This, the biodiversity, it's very important for the integrity of biosphere. It can provide food, medicines, and it can also provide spiritual and aesthetic well-being. And because of eutrophication, there is changes in the light patterns and the nutrients. This is causing shift in the species composition. The tolerant species that can survive, they are surviving, and those that cannot survive, they are either dying or moving to another habitats. And for example, macroalgae and massive biomass of the aquatic plants that were increased in some were those that were outcompeted, that they were diminished, and those that could survive, they remained, and they survived the eutrophic environment. Similarly, the acidification, acidification is adding more protons and aluminum ions, and it's causing decrease in nematode activity, and there is also decrease in microbial activity, and those crop species that are susceptible to acidification, they cannot grow, and only those that can survive the acidified environment will only survive in this region. And because of this acidification, we have observed decline in plant species richness and productivity and different. And in this figure, it shows that between 1980 to up to 2010, there were different nitrogen rates were applied. And you can see that during 1980s, when the nitrogen fertilizer was high, there was high productivity. But this high productivity did not last longer. With continuous increase in high nitrogen input, there was decrease in productivity. And same was observed in the diversity. You can see it on figure B. When there was high nitrogen input, there was less or negative rate of biodiversity. And all these factors, they are causing decrease in biodiversity. So what are the recommendations? We should use nitrogen judiciously. Integrated nutrient management practices should be followed. Enhanced MC fertilizer can be done. Manure should be added with the fertilizer acidification process. Techniques like denitrification and it's important for the stakeholders to do legislations to control excessive nitrogen fertilization. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sajjad, for this very detailed talk and synthesizing many different rich data sets. You have elaborated how inefficient utilization of nitrogen is causing eutrophication and biodiversity, and how these two are in combination affecting the biodiversity. Thank you so much for this enlightening talk.